Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, what might Donte DiVincenzo's role look like this year? How much will it, or at least should it, change compared to last season, his first in Minnesota? We'll break down that, plus a couple of key points about the Timberwolves schedule that was released late last week. It's all coming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by FanDuel. Football season is around the corner. Visit the FanDuel app today and start planning your futures bets now. Happy Monday, everybody. Hopefully you had a fantastic weekend. And today, we're going to get to some more schedule stuff at the end. We did a lot Friday, so if you're riding high off the schedule release, which actually I really love that piece of the offseason every year, that was Friday's show. We hit a couple of high points from the schedule at the end of the show today, but did a lot about it on Friday's show. Today, I want to lock in on Donte DiVincenzo's role. This is something else we've covered a little this offseason, but I want to spend a full couple of segments here talking about why Donte DiVincenzo's role will very likely look different this year, and why it probably should look different compared to what it was in his first season with the Timberwolves. I'll explain what I mean by that, give some context based on 2 years ago with the Knicks, and actually 3 years ago with the Warriors, and how his role last year was different in Minnesota, and why it should be different in 2025-26 than it was last year. So that's what we'll start the show with today. Big thank you here off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. You can listen anywhere you like to listen to podcasts. You can also watch on YouTube, or you could download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV and watch Locked On Wolves there as well. All right, let's start here with Donte DiVincenzo. And the context here for Donte is that last season, like if you asked, my guess is, it's a guess, if you polled 100 Timberwolves fans and said, what'd you think of Donte DiVincenzo in year one in Minnesota? My hunch is more than half of them would be like, I was expecting more. He was really hot in the preseason and, a little too streaky, struggled defensively. Wish he hadn't hurt his toe in January. He's good. I thought he'd be better. I bet I know that's a lot of words, but like I think generally the gist of that's probably basically what I would have said. If you ask me, what do you think of Donte DiVincenzo's year one in Minnesota? My answer would be, look, I was expecting a little bit more from him as a scorer. I thought he'd look a little more comfortable coming off the bench as a scorer. I wasn't necessarily, I think he was a little overrated defensively. We talked about this when the Wolves acquired him, not even a year ago, 11 months ago, that in New York, he was asked to guard a lot of kind of high usage high usage scorers, ball handlers on the perimeter, because that version of the Knicks, when DiVincenzo was there, didn't have as many of those perimeter defenders like Minnesota had. And I thought DiVincenzo would make a big impact defensively simply because he wouldn't have to guard opposing team's best or even second best ball handler. But the nature of it was a lot of times the lineups he was in, he was doing just that. And the compete level was higher than frankly, a average run in the middle Tuesday, Wednesday in the middle of the season than you're going to get from Anthony Edwards defensively. But obviously the ceiling of what Ant can give you defensively is nowhere, or it's much greater than what DiVincenzo can give you. So it was, defensively, I thought he was a little disappointing. Offensively, it's funny because I don't know that many Wolves fans would realize that he actually shot 40% from three last year. It's probably because the first taste of Donte in a Wolves uniform was just flamethrowing in preseason, or I'm not convinced he missed a shot, honestly. He was great in preseason, and then he started the season ice cold. Started to get hot when he got added to the starting lineup in January, hurts his big toe against the Warriors, misses a month, comes back, takes him a little while to get his legs under him, and eventually, ends up shooting 39.7% from three, which is only 0.04% less or lower than what he shot his lone season with the Knicks. And exactly the same, 39.7% to the 10th of a percentage point, what he shot in a full season with Golden State 2 years ago. Now, I think that's important context to what Donte did last season. So I think we should start there with this baseline of what did the season look like? Donte last year averaged just under 12 points a game. He shot almost 40%. You'd round that to 40% from three, which is what he shot with the Knicks. The difference is that he was asked to handle the ball a lot more than he was in New York. He effectively was a secondary ball handler all the time, and occasionally even really a point guard with Minnesota, in part due to, well, really mostly due to roster construction more than anything else. And he shot more threes than he did in New York, at least by a rate base. So 74% of his shots, essentially 3/4 of the shots, 3 in every 4 shots that Donte was taking were threes. It was 70% in New York, 70% the year before in Golden State. So not a lot higher, but it was a higher 3-point rate. So he didn't take a ton of twos. In fact, if you want to, this is just maybe a better way to look at it from a snapshot standpoint. He only averaged 2.5 2-point shots a game. In New York, he averaged almost 4 per game. Now he averaged more minutes per game. And again, the scoring volume was higher. So a lot of that is opportunity, but some of that is rate, right? About 5% more of his shot attempts, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it adds up, came from 3 versus from 2. So he shot 1.2 less 2-point shots in Minnesota than he did in New York. And he was 5.2% worse on twos. So the 2-point efficiency dragged down his overall shooting percentage. He was only 42% from the field, which was his lowest since his rookie season when he played really sparingly in Milwaukee as a mid-first round pick on a good team. So the overall field goal percentage was essentially a career low. You know what? I take that back. The year he got traded from Milwaukee to Sacramento was actually a little worse than that, but worse than it was in New York, worse than it was in Golden State 2 years ago. So that he shot less twos and he shot them less efficiently. He got to the line a little bit less often as well, which of course happens if you shoot less twos. And he was also being tasked with, hey, can you run some offense too? Like if you look, no matter how you slice it, actually Basketball Reference says he played point guard 71% of the time. That number's misleading because he was on the floor with Ant a ton and Ant was essentially running the point. But if Donte is the only other ball handler on the floor, that means you're essentially splitting those duties. And he may be the one bringing it up the floor and deferring to Ant, which is often what Mike Conley does anyway. So Dante's getting off the ball, but because he's creating for others, quote unquote, and getting off the ball early in a possession, there's going to be less scoring opportunities off the bounce for Donte DiVincenzo. And the assist rate last season was the highest that we've seen in his career. With the Knicks, DiVincenzo's assist rate was just 13.7%. If you're not familiar with that stat, it's the percentage of teammates shots made by teammates when Donte was on the floor. With the Knicks, under 14% he assisted on. With the Wolves, over 20%, easily a career high by more than 3 percentage points. A 20.2 assist rate for Donte in Minnesota. So what do we know? Well, the assist rate was a career high. The 3-point rate was a career high. The turnover rate was actually lower, not lower than with the Knicks, but lower than it was with Milwaukee, Sacramento, Golden State earlier in his career. So the turnover rate was actually fine. That's a really interesting combination. So the assist rate is up, but so is the 3-point rate. What does that mean? Well, we already established he shot less twos. What does that mean for what his role should look like next year? And why I think we could actually look at last season as largely a success from Donte DiVincenzo. And I think there's more to unlock from the Wolves version of Donte than what we saw last year. And without taking anything away from what I think was an underrated Donte DiVincenzo season, I want to dive into that a little deeper here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors at FanDuel. August 26th, just over a week from now, is officially FanDuel Futures Day, a brand new holiday for football fans who live for bold predictions and preseason hunches. For just 24 hours, is a week from tomorrow, FanDuel is giving you deals on NFL season predictions. So whether you're calling your MVP, eyeing a long shot division winner, or ready to crown your Super Bowl champ before week 1 even kicks off, this is your moment. Maybe you want to take a flyer on the MVP race. There's plenty of pretty intriguing props out there when it comes to MVP. I'm going to pull it up right now. For instance, the favorite, of course, is Lamar. Lamar Jackson's plus 430, not surprising. Josh Allen, not surprising, is second. He's actually tied with Joe Burrow at plus 600. But, there's a lot of guys that are a little bit down that list that the odds aren't too bad. I mean, Jalen Hurts is plus 2,000. I know that, he wasn't the reason they won the Super Bowl last year, but he's on the defending Super Bowl champs. It's hard to repeat, of course. I don't know, Jordan Love, I know, dangerous to say on this podcast, Jordan Love at plus 2,000 isn't bad. Jared Goff at plus 3,500. The Lions should still be good. I know they've had a lot of change. But anyway, if you're going to take a flyer, go down. There's a lot of names on there that are pretty intriguing. Or you just want to crown your champion in August, pick who you think is going to win, look at the overall field. Maybe you just want to parlay your division winner dark horses together for a nice payout. Right now, you can visit the FanDuel app and start planning your futures bet now. Futures Day is upcoming next Tuesday, August 26th. Futures Day is one day and one day only. FanDuel, play your game. Okay, talking Donte DiVincenzo, what his role is going to be this year and why. So we established the higher 3-point rate and the higher assist rate. The other thing that I think is interesting, if you look at his stats from last year, is that a lower percentage of his 3-point makes and attempts were assisted than really ever before. You go back to before he was a regular rotation guy in Milwaukee, and that would be the only other time where you've got a lower percentage of his 3-point shots assisted. Only 85% of his made threes were assisted this year. Okay. Which is a big number, but 92% with the Knicks were assisted. 93% with the Warriors were assisted. Why is that? Well, he had the ball in his hands more, and the 3-point rate was higher. And while he was being tasked with initiating for others, the answer was never, I'm going to probe and maybe get to the rim, like what we saw him do in a Knicks uniform relatively frequently. Instead, it's, I'm going to pass or I'm going to launch, and I'm going to get off the ball, but I might not get it back because it's Anthony Edwards and he's going to run the offense. And I'm, when Donte's on the floor, he's often at least the third option, no higher. That wasn't always the case with the Knicks. Remember, he averaged 15.5 points a game with New York. So essentially his opportunities were fewer and farther between. And so he was launching or he was making a quick decision, which is a good thing, making a quick decision. I think his on-court impact was actually really good last year. I think that he was better than he was for his one season with the Warriors when he was a part-time starter. Actually, exactly half of his games that season, he came off the bench. Half of them he started with the Warriors. He played less overall minutes because he was hurt this last season and played 10 less games than he did with Golden State. With New York, he was mostly a starter, and he was relied upon to score for a good Knicks team. I mean, this is pre-Cat Knicks, right? This is injured Julius Randle New York Knicks. And they needed, and pre Mikal Bridges, and that was during the season. I think they traded for Anunoby. So like they needed buckets from Donte, and he gave those to them. And he wasn't asked to do as much in a Timberwolves uniform. 2 years ago with Golden State, it was somewhere in between. And I would argue he was not as effective with the Warriors as he was with Minnesota last year. The 3-point rate was in line with where it was with the Knicks, but he didn't shoot them quite as well. The 2-point percentage was also not great. He didn't get to the line enough for what he did. And I thought defensively, he was good in Golden State, but the assist rate was lower. The turnover rate was higher. And that's partly a Warriors thing, just the speed with which they play and the amount of turnovers they tend to rack up. All that to say, I thought last year's version of Donte was a really impactful piece of what the Wolves were doing. And if you look at the on-off numbers, those are also not, none of this is gospel, right? You can't take one thing and be like, it's like back when people would use PER to PER win shares. Like, it's been a while since I've gotten on this soapbox, so I'll keep this brief. But obviously one stat is never the end all be all. You have to take it all and consider it, right? It's like when you're getting ready for any draft in any sport, NFL and NBA stick out in my mind. MLB the same way. The combine is a piece of it. The combine is not the only thing, right? The interviews with the team are a piece of it. They're not the only thing. The scrimmage at the combine is a piece of it. It's not the only thing. The March Madness performance is a piece of it. It's not the only thing, right? You take all the info you have and you make a decision based on that. It's a little bit what this is, obviously not identical, but you can't take the on-off and be like, oh man, Donte wasn't as good as I thought he was last year because on-off says that the Wolves were actually a minus 0.7. Well, guess what? Depending on where you look, I'm looking at Cleaning the Glass. It says that they were a 52nd percentile offense with DiVincenzo on the floor. Well, guess what? It also, or a 48th percentile overall differential. With Anthony Edwards, it says they were a minus 0.6, 48th overall percentile. And defensively, we're an 18th percentile defense with Anthony Edwards on the floor. Well, individual player on-off is inherently noisy because you're talking about one guy. It matters who they shared the floor with, which is why I mostly cite specific lineup data. I think that gives us the most insight. And sure enough, if you look at the lineups with which Donte DiVincenzo played the most, he was on the floor with, the lineup he played the most with. We'll just do this. The 5-man unit that Donte DiVincenzo was on the floor the most with was the starters minus Mike Conley. Okay, so it was Ant and Donte in the backcourt, and your starting front court of Jaden McDaniels, Julius Randle, and Rudy Gobert. That's not going to be a very good offensive group. There's a reason why the Wolves traded up and drafted Rob Dillingham. Because, yes, Jaden's improved offensively, and yes, Julius Randle can be good offensively, and obviously Ant is good. But if it's Ant and a bunch of not plus offensive players, which Rudy's not a plus offensive player, and you would not describe Jaden McDaniels as one, and the numbers would suggest that Julius Randle often isn't a plus offensive player, well, he adds an important element to the Wolves offense and is a very important player and was very good for the Wolves last year. There's a reason those lineups struggled offensively and therefore struggled overall. They actually struggled defensively too. And I would put that more on Randle than DiVincenzo, and probably more on Ant even than DiVincenzo, because I think Ant, as I mentioned in the first segment, was very spotty defensively last year, which is something we got to keep an eye out for this year. All that to say, the most used DiVincenzo lineup was a 50th percentile unit, a plus 3.2 overall. So fine, but nowhere near as good as most of the rest of the DiVincenzo lineups. In fact, overall, units with Donte DiVincenzo, those 5-man units were positive units. The second most utilized Donte DiVincenzo lineup also had Julius Randle and Anthony Edwards, but instead of McDaniels, it had Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and instead of Rudy, it had Naz Reid. Predictably, those lineups were bad defensively because Naz was at the 5 and Randle was at the 4, and McDaniels and Rudy weren't on the floor. But they were outstanding offensively, 95th percentile offensive units, because how are you going to stop a unit that's got Ant, DiVincenzo, Randle, Naz Reid, and a 40+% catch and shoot guy, Nickeil Alexander-Walker? So it's a give and a take, but you can't just look at the on-off number, because obviously nobody's arguing the Wolves are better with Anthony Edwards off the floor, right? But the numbers would say it's close to a wash. That number itself is, you need to look at the context. And Ant played with all kinds of lineups and all kinds of non-scoring players with him. And it's part of the reason I have some optimism for this team being better this year, the Wolves being better this year than last year, because you're replacing Nickeil with a guy in very likely TJ Shannon and maybe also Rob Dillingham, who both are better all-around offensive players than Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Yes, Nickeil is a great catch-and-shoot guy, but I think that there's more levels to get to offensively when you're replacing him with guys like Shannon and Dillingham, etc. Back to the DiVincenzo point, it matters who he was on the floor with. And he was often on the floor with lineups that didn't have other outstanding offensive players. But again, the example of when he's on the floor with Naz and Ant and Randle instead of McDaniels and Gobert and Randle, the offense skyrockets. And again, defensively, when he's on the floor with McDaniels and Ant, he wasn't always getting the toughest. He was never getting the toughest and rarely even getting the second toughest defensive assignment, which, lowers what that impact could be. But it also overall, I think that's the most important point, is it lowers his overall impact. So given some of the lineups that we saw success with Donte DiVincenzo, I think there's a good chance that as that gets tweaked this year, and obviously no Nickeil, and I think there's going to be some hey, what are the most should Rob Dillingham be on the floor with Jaden McDaniels? Is that how this should work, instead of being on the floor with, last year it was with Nickeil or whatever? What's going to make Dillingham the most successful? What's going to make TJ Shannon the most successful? If we get more scoring punch out of that role, do you worry more about one of them should be on the floor with Ant to help second side attacks and balance the floor a little better, keep teams from loading up on Ant? I think that's a thing. Whereas obviously teams weren't worried about Nickeil Alexander-Walker beating them off the dribble. They may worry about Rob Dillingham if he could show something. They may worry about TJ Shannon if he ups his half court scoring. All that to say, we want more Knicks Donte DiVincenzo, but I would argue that last season in Minnesota was still better than his lone season in Golden State, despite being given more responsibilities as essentially a co-point guard with Anthony Edwards when he was on the floor with Ant, which I just talked about, those lineups that were successful with the two of them on the floor together. Donte's top 3 lineups and 5 of his top 6 most used lineups were with Anthony Edwards. So you go to Basketball Reference and that's going to log those as him as the point guard. Cleaning the Glass would flip it and they would say Ant's the point guard. I think that's closer to the truth. I think, I would consider Ant the point guard in that situation, but they were essentially splitting playmaking duties. They're essentially splitting point guard duties. So Donte was given more responsibility, had a better assist rate, a lower turnover rate than in New York, essentially the same 3-point percentage. So he improved those efficiencies while taking on more responsibilities. The on-off stuff is misleading. The overall season, the body of work is actually much better than I think the average Timberwolves fan would react to. Like if you just said, what was the Donte season like? I don't think you're going to get a ton of super positive responses. I think it was a good season, and I think this year could be better because more could be taken off his plate. Now, the flip side of it, the counter argument is, hey, you're losing to Keel. He was the backup point guard. So now what happens? Well, I don't necessarily think it falls to Donte. I think probably more goes to Ant and possibly Rob Dillingham with TJ Shannon as the secondary creator and maybe some secondary creation for Donte. But I think overall, I don't necessarily think he's going to be asked to run the offense any more than he was last year. Donte just launched more off the dribble this year. Can he put more pressure on the rim as a second side attacker if he's on the floor with Ant? There's some of those tweaks I think that we can look forward to. But all that to say, if he plays like he did last year and just improves the efficiency a little bit, I think he's going to have a really good season. He's going to be a big part of this team winning more than 49 games the regular season, which I think they will. All right. I want to talk a couple more schedule things. We'll do that here next to close out the show. All right. So if you missed it on Friday, the schedule came out Thursday, during the day, Thursday, last week. So Friday, I did most of the show on the schedule. I really leaned into quick highlights, toughest month, easiest stretch, etc. Want to hit a couple more notes today, and we'll probably do so a little more each day this week that we have a show because I do think it's fun to dig into. I talked on Friday about March and April being extremely tough for the Wolves and how that was the toughest stretch. I don't have it in front of me, but I think I said it wouldn't surprise me if they were barely above 500 through the months of March and April, but it also wouldn't shock me if they were like single-digit losses by New Year's Day. Like I think the beginning of the season, the schedule is that we'll call it forgiving. Again, it's silly a little bit because we don't know in 2 months when the regular season starts, like almost exactly 2 months, just how good some of these teams might actually be. But based on looking at it right now, I would argue like, hey, the first 2.5 months, October through December, are very palatable months for the Timberwolves. March and April, not so much. And I focused on the opponents. I focused on a little bit the overall home road. But what I missed is, so March and April are really weird. So like March starts out, you get a 3-game homestand, you get a 4-game road trip, which is a West Coast road trip. Always tough. By the way, the Wolves don't have any road trips next season for longer than 4 games, which is great. West Coast road trip includes a back-to-back Lakers, Clippers in LA. So there's no travel, but it's still a tough back-to-back at Golden State, at OKC. That's a tough road trip. Then you get another 3-game homestand, go to Boston, home for Houston and Detroit, and then you close with 6 of 7 on the road, and then a final home game against the Pelicans, who probably will be very bad and who, unlikely Zion Williamson is playing in the final game of next season. I hope I'm wrong. I hope he's healthy, and I hope that they're not too good, but I hope he's healthy at least, right? But the Wolves close with 6 of 7 on the road, and then the Pelicans at home. So technically 6 of 8 on the road. At Dallas, at Detroit, at Philadelphia. Detroit-Philadelphia back-to-back is brutal. And who knows what the state of Joel Embiid and Paul George will be on April 3rd. But that's a road back-to-back. Home for 1 game against Charlotte, which is obviously winnable, but a very dangerous game if this Wolves team plays like they have often in these similar situations, right? You come home for a 1-game road homestand, quote-unquote homestand. All too often, that's just kind of a trap, right? So you almost want it to be a tougher opponent, but it's Charlotte. Then you go on the road at Indiana, at Orlando is about as tough a back-to-back as you're going to get. You're traveling, I don't know, what is that? Probably a 2.5-hour flight from Indianapolis to Orlando, maybe 3 hours. And it's 2 of the top, 4 teams in the East, most likely? I suppose, who knows at that point with Tyrese Haliburton? I doubt he's playing at that point, considering when the injury happened. Yeah, I guess Tatum's more likely to be playing. I really doubt Tyrese is playing. Still a good team, a well-coached team, and could be fighting for a playoff spot, right? And then at Orlando on the second night of a back-to-back, Orlando is going to be very good. And then you have a day off before you go at Houston and finish at home against the Pelicans. So just the sheer 6 road games in 7 days, including 2 back-to-backs in that stretch, that's a really tough way to close out the season. And hopefully Minnesota's locked something up, like a home court advantage situation, or at least knowing they're out of the play-in. So you don't have to just kill themselves to make sure that they win every last one of those games. So that's a bit dicey to close the season. We did also talk about national TV games, and there were a couple of different places that put together, the total number of national TV games for everyone. So all credit. I think I saw it on, I guess Hoops Rumors is where I saw it, but the overall nationally televised games, the Wolves are tied for second with Houston. So the teams that are tied for the most are the champions, the OKC Thunder, and then three teams with massive fan bases, the Warriors, Lakers, and Knicks, each with 34 national TV games. The Wolves are tied with Houston for second, which feels about right. I mean, Houston was the number 2 seed last year. They traded for Kevin Durant. It makes sense. And a lot of people, we talked about this, early last week or the week before, that Houston keeps getting ranked ahead of Minnesota in power rankings. I don't buy it. I think the Wolves will be better this year. But Houston is tied with Minnesota for 28 nationally televised games this year. Denver's next with 26, Boston with 25, which no Jason Tatum, still surprised only 25. The Cavs with 24, they should be higher, but Donovan Mitchell doesn't carry the same national TV star power, right or wrong, as Anthony Edwards. I mean, I know why, right? Like, we all know why. But Cleveland in the East probably will win a lot of games this year. Obviously, some injury concerns there too, but still. Dallas at 10, Cooper Flagg is pretty much the reason, but no Luka would be the reason they're down that low. The Spurs at 11, Wemby obviously the only reason there, and then the Clippers at 12, and then from there it's kind of it drops off a bit. Pacers only have 9, which is weird for a team that was in the finals, but the no Halliburton factor matters a ton. Actually every team has at least 2, which is interesting. And there's a note here on Hoops Rumors as well that last year the Wizards had 1, but then they were flexed out of it. So they actually were the only team that didn't have any. And this year everybody starts with at least 2, which is probably an effort to say, all right, if we got to flex out of a Jazz national TV game, they've got 2, or a Raptors, they've got 2. Fine, but then they still get 1 more, right? Remember all the years when the Wolves would get 1 to 3 national TV games, like basically every year until recently. The last thing I want to talk about is the back-to-backs. I mentioned that the Wolves have 2 in the final couple weeks of the season. Overall, Minnesota's tied for the least back-to-backs of any team in the NBA. Now, the team with the most, there's 5 teams that have 16 back-to-backs, and there's 6 teams that only have 13. The Wolves are one of those 6 teams, which is fantastic. I haven't seen the numbers on total miles traveled for this season, but usually Minnesota ends up with the most miles traveled of anybody. They're in the center of the country, so at first glance, you're like, oh, why? Wouldn't you think that the teams going east to west? Well, no, because those teams only go to the opposite coast a couple times a year, whereas Minnesota has teams like Portland. Like, all the teams in Minnesota's division are far, Portland and Utah, right? Like, those are far flights. Oklahoma City's not as bad. Denver is somewhere in the middle. But their division is so spread out. And Minnesota being in the middle, like Minneapolis to Orlando and Miami is a long trip. Minneapolis to LA is a pretty long trip. Not as much for like the teams in Texas. That's a shorter flight, right? The teams on the West Coast are staying on the West Coast except for when they have to go to the East. So Minnesota usually has some of the highest miles traveled of any team. So it's nice that they're tied for the least amount of back-to-backs with the Thunder, and then 4 Eastern Conference teams in the Hawks, Celtics, Bulls, and Pacers. Okay, more schedule analysis to come later this week. Maybe some predictions. Still feels really early for that. But programming note, we are still on our 3-show-a-week plan, so very likely this week we'll do shows Wednesday and Friday as well. At least Wednesday and Friday. May slip another show in there, TBD. So stay tuned as we go throughout the week. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. A reminder that for your second listen, you can check out the Locked On NBA podcast. Our guys Doug, Matt, and Hayes will keep you up to date on contract negotiations, rumors, and everything you need to be the most informed NBA fan. Find Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you like to listen to podcasts. Of course, just like this show, it's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Of course, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.